When you picture the Vikings, the iconic Norse seafarers famed for their ferocity and fabulous beard density, you might conjure images of flame-lit long hauls, roaring fires, and mugs of mead sloshing about like seawater near a fjord. Now take that mental image and throw it into the North Sea. Because when these fur-clad warriors sailed across icy waters in narrow wooden ships, do you know how often they had fires? Hardly ever. There's a reason you don't see a lot of flames on wooden boats. It's because sailors generally prefer their vessels not to end in unscheduled barbecues. A fire on board would be, historically speaking, what's known as a bad idea. So how did Vikings keep warm as they crossed oceans of slush without setting themselves or their ships on fire? Well, let's start with the first and coziest answer. Wool. Mountains of it. The Vikings were deeply into wool, the way modern Scandinavians are into sleek furniture and cold plunges. Except their wool wasn't just for fashion statements. It was life-saving. They wore layers, and not dainty, polite layers like we do today. They layered like onions who knew the ship wouldn't dock for 3 weeks. Thin wool undergarments, thicker tunics, cloaks, mittens made from rough sheep's wool that could probably sandwood, and hats. Lots of hats. Wool was the textile equivalent of a warm hug from an indifferent Norse grandmother. Even when wet, wool keeps you warm, which is useful when you're being gently misted by Atlantic spray every time someone sneezes on the waves. Not only that, Viking cloaks were often fastened with brooches or pins, not just for looks, though yes, Vikings did love a little sparkle, but because cloaks wrapped snugly around the body and needed anchoring. Clever anchoring. You don't want to lose your only cloak to a gust of wind when you're several days from the nearest dry land or even a slightly warmer rock. But it wasn't just clothing. These early mariners had something warmer than fire, each other. In the longboats, which were more like low, elongated bathtubs than actual ships, Vikings likely slept huddled together for warmth. Privacy was a luxury, and personal space was a foreign concept when your breath turned to silver in the air and your toes considered retirement. Warriors, deckhands, and even aristocratic types might have lain shoulder to shoulder beneath heavy woolen blankets, about as snugly as a field trip on a hay wagon. And let's talk beds, or not beds, really. The longships didn't have cabins, no bunk beds, no hammocks with whimsical embroidered names above them, just planks, wet planks, sometimes above fish barrels. So they padded out their sleeping spots with straw, animal skins, or even woven mats. These too would get damp. It was a lifestyle made possible only by truly astonishing body heat, layers, and a general Norse disinterest in comfort as a concept. Now, for food. Because heat isn't just something you wear, it's something you digest. Vikings consumed a diet heavy in fat and protein. Dried fish, preserved meats, hard bread that could possibly double as small shields, and porridge. So much porridge. A warm belly of barley mush might not sound like an adventure, but it's exactly what you want when the air is so cold your eyebrows have gone crunchy. Did they ferry little pots of soup around? Not likely. Fire on board was limited to rare occasions when they could safely light a contained flame, perhaps on land or during calm water stops. And even then, they often cooked their meals before setting out, then kept them in sealed containers. And don't forget the drink. Mead, ale, and sometimes just water if they were feeling medieval chic. While alcohol doesn't actually warm you, fun myth, it does make you feel warmer, which, after all, is sometimes enough. But ultimately, At the heart of the Viking warmth secret wasn't just wool or food or awkward group cuddling. It was resilience, and perhaps stubbornness. These folks crossed icy waters because they believed the world was worth seeing, and they saw no reason why the weather should stop them from doing so with some flair and an impressive collection of sheep-based fashion. So next time you're shuffling around your apartment in thick socks and muttering about the thermostat, remember, at least you're not huddled in a wooden ship, wearing half a fleece-coated animal and using a fish barrel as a pillow. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now close your eyes and let's drift further into the hush of history. There is something undeniably admirable about a person so determined to go pillaging that they forget to invent central heating. This, dear listener, brings us comfortably to the core mystery of our night. How on earth, or rather, how on the ice-raked waves of the North Sea, did Vikings manage to not freeze into elegantly bearded popsicles while sailing in what essentially amounted to very large, pointy bathtubs? Before we pull up the fuzzy, woolly curtain on Viking temperature control, we must set the scene. Picture a longship, not much wider than your cousin's kayak, but with a prow carved like it just lost a staring contest with a dragon. It creaks gently over grey, frigid waters, pulled along by 30 burly rowers whose idea of a suitable work outfit is a tunic and eternal stoicism. No cabins, no below deck, no roaring hearth or hot cocoa, just wind, salt, and raw stubbornness. So how did they stay warm? The secret began with sheep, yes. Not mythical firestones or magical runes. Sheep. Wool, in the Viking world, was not just for sweaters your aunt insists look snug. It was a textile superhero. Viking wool was dense, oily, and had the rather unfashionable quality of smelling like a damp pet when wet. But this mild olfactory offense was forgiven because of its astonishing ability to insulate. Viking wives, mothers, and various other industrious ladies spun and wove the wool into thick cloaks, leggings, mittens, and hats, though the last possibly looked more like upside-down woolen buckets. They also employed a bit of ancient layering wisdom, known in modern terms as dressing like an onion, a principle involving a base layer of linen, soft, breezy, excellent for avoiding chafing, mid-layer of felted wool, warm and vaguely scratchy, and an outer layer that could stop a mild breeze and occasionally a confused spear. But wait, a cold wind cuts through wool. You protest in your mind as you recall that one particularly bracing school field trip. True, which is why leather played a role too. The Vikings wore tightly stitched fur-lined leather cloaks or jerkins which, combined with wool, created the kind of cozy resilience usually only attributed to tea cozies or particularly plump hibernating bears. Let us not forget fur itself. While modern stereotypes would have us picture every Viking draped like a yeti at Fashion Week, the reality was a bit patchier. They did wear fur, fox, bear, wolf, when they could get it. It wasn't everyday garb. It was prized and practical. A warm fur hood wouldn't just keep your ears attached during a squall. It might also make your head harder to distinguish from prey if you accidentally dozed off in a forest. Efficient. But Vikings knew the cold wasn't just battled on the surface. You had to fight it from within. Enter calorie hoarding. And I do mean hoarding. Nobody in a Viking crew was dainty about dinner. Think dried fish, slabs of smoked whale, meaty stews with barley or root vegetables when available, and buckets of buttered oats sloshed about in sea-chilled bowls. One hearty meal could start combustion in your core and keep it humming through hours of rowing. Incidentally, the Latin word cala means heat, reminding us that when your belly's full, your blood is braver. They also drank, not rum like pirates, but mead, honey wine, an ale that probably tasted like warm sadness, but offered a calorie boost and a hint of psychological insulation. Fortunately for everyone on board, they weren't drinking to get tipsy. They were essentially sipping practicality. Now, you might be wondering, what of the toes, those fragile little frost targets? Viking boots were marvels of simple engineering, soft leather, fur linings, often stuffed with straw or moss when times got desperate. Not stylish per se, unless you're into woodland scarecrow chic, but impressively effective. All these bits, the cloaks, the stew, the slightly alcoholic resolve, worked harmoniously, like a well-insulated orchestra. And if none of it worked, and you still felt cold, well, you simply huddled. Yes, we've come to the ancient Scandinavian technique known informally as the tactical snuggle. Viking warriors, despite their rugged exteriors and apparent fondness for hitting things with axes, understood that body heat is body heat. So on long voyages, men often scooted closer under shared cloaks, sleeping in group warmth like human cinnamon rolls. It wasn't considered weird, it was considered survival. Besides, nothing builds camaraderie like sleeping on your comrade's elbow for several nights in a row. With no chimneys to warm themselves by, the Vikings mocked fire by becoming the embers. Layered, fed, and clustered, they rode through frosted spray with cheeks red from wind and spirits undampened. And so, when wind howled through the rigging and ice poked sly fingers between woolen folds, they simply pulled their cloaks tighter, perhaps cursed Thor casually under their breath, and rowed on. Next, we'll drift into another curious mystery of Viking life, a question less about warmth and more about something equally vital. How did one keep their beard so mysteriously well groomed while living in a boatload of bearded men? But that can wait. Far out in the salt-stained stillness of the northern sea, the wind hummed through the rigging like a half-remembered lullaby. On a pine-planked longship, creaking quietly beneath a dome of greyish stars, our Viking friends huddled together under layers of wool and stubborn optimism. There is something wonderfully ironic about a people famed for setting things on fire. Villages, monasteries, the occasional feast table, living their lives on boats where fire was not just inconvenient, but actively suicidal. Flames on a wooden ship, that's less cozy campfire, more floating funeral. And yet, the Vikings endured the frigid sea winds like seasoned champions of chill, wrapped in garments that would make a modern fashionista shudder, but a sheep quite proud. Let's begin with the foundation. Wool. Not the scratchy, sad kind your aunt knits into a birthday sweater, but dense, sheep-to-shoulder masterpieces. Wool was the miracle fabric of the Norse world. It insulates even when wet, which it almost always was in the seafaring north. Viking wool came from hardy northern sheep, the sort of sheep that would likely scoff at tropical breezes and demand a harder climate. Wool garments were layered like a historical onion. Each Viking sailor might wear 2 or 3 tunics, thick woolen trousers, woolen socks, and a long cloak fastened with what we today might call a statement brooch. Impressive, yes, but mainly practical. That cloak was their blanket, their barrier against frost, their sleeping bag by another name. And then, of course, there were the hats, the quintessential Viking helmet of modern imagination, with those endearingly impractical horns, was never actually used, but wool hats, Absolutely. Pointed, rounded, fur-lined, headdress chic, Viking edition. By covering the top of the head, they maintain that most essential of warmth rules, heat rises, and so must whatever is trying to escape from your scalp. Boots, too, were a matter of both survival and cozy fashion. They were stitched from leather or hide, sometimes fur-lined, and tied up with rawhide laces like rustic sneakers that never saw joggers but spent a lot of time stepping on fish guts. But warmth didn't come just from clothing. No, the Vikings had figured out the true secret to staying warm amid icy waves and unforgiving skies: each other. On the longship, sleeping arrangements were less assign bunk and more find a corner and don't snore too loudly. They lay side by side beneath shared cloaks, arms crossed, shoulders overlapping like cold sardines, trying a trust exercise. Human warmth, after all, is a quiet kind of fire, radiant, renewable, and far less likely to burn a hole through the deck. Some ships even had sewn leather coverings or canvas tents that draped over the midsection of the vessel, like a great sea turtle shell. Not especially elegant, but it cut the wind, kept the sleet off the crew, and added a hint of home away from fjord ambience. And then there was something else, something even the best wool couldn't match, a curious warmth that came from storytelling. In the cold, dark stretch of night on ink-black waters, Viking sailors would tell tales. Skalds, Norse poets, recited sagas of gods and giants, hero kings and shield maidens, some strong enough to catch a sword with one hand and a punchline with the other. These sagas were not merely entertainment. They were, in a way, an act of insulation. Stories wove together warmth, reminding everyone that spring would come, that storms would pass, and that someone eventually would invent central heating. And just in case you think everything was majestic grit and endless bravery, remember, Vikings also cuddled up with spoons. Not the cutlery, no. Spoons, in this context, were a sleeping arrangement. Two sleeping sailors would lie front to back and, well, you get the idea. Your battle-hardened, axe-wielding raider might also be the big spoon after a long day of rowing and raiding. Practical, yes. Intimate, possibly. Warms the feet, absolutely. They did what they had to, reeking slightly of salted herring and determination, trusting in layers of cloth, closeness, and the kind of resilience born only from a lifetime of soggy winters. Now, with warm cloaks drawn tight and saga whispers soft as snowflakes, the Viking ship drifts deeper into night. And before the stars shift in their quiet sky, we might just find ourselves wondering, what did they eat for breakfast, those frostbitten mariners? Surely not just more dried fish. Or was it the Viking longship, lean, hungry, and utterly fireless, is perhaps one of history's boldest design risks? Imagine being surrounded by cold iron, colder seawater, and 14 cousins who all snore like wounded moose, and doing it all without so much as a single ember to warm your socks, if they wore socks. And no, they didn't line the bottom of the ship with heated floors. We checked, but somehow the Norse navigators endured weeks, even months, of chilly, salt-sprayed voyages across the North Atlantic, with no fire on deck, no below-deck cabins, and absolutely no climate control, unless you count Thor, who rarely consulted with them on thermostat settings. To understand how they pulled off this frosty feat, we must first snuggle into something the Vikings truly cherished: wool. Viking wool wasn't just any scratchy material for itchy sweaters. This wasn't the kind of wool you get for your birthday and politely wear once. No, we're talking oiled wool, famously from the fleece of North Atlantic sheep, who themselves looked like miniature Vikings after a hard day at sea. These sheep were specially bred, or perhaps mildly threatened, to have incredibly resilient coats. Vikings sheared them, spun the wool by hand, and then wove it into thick, wind-battering cloaks, tunics, and leg wrappings. The wool was often lanolin-rich, aka greasy, which sounds less than fashionable, but was deeply practical. The natural oils acted as waterproofing, repelling sea spray with the quiet dignity of a duck in a rainstorm. Picture a crew of rugged sailors, their breath curling through the icy air, dressed head to toe in layers of this wondrous sheep technology. Their feet were bundled in woolen binders stuffed into leather boots, while on their heads rested felted caps, adorably lumpy, likely itchy, but gloriously warm. And underneath all those layers, linen. Yes, the world's chillier cousin to cotton. While wool did the hard outer work, linen handled the snuggling. It was soft, breathable, and could be wrapped around the body in all sorts of complicated, not intensive arrangements that may or may not have required a family consultation to undo. There were no metal heaters, no hot cocoa, just layers. So many layers that every Viking voyage probably started with at least one sailor collapsing under the weight of his own wardrobe. They dressed like onions, angry onions, with axes, but even the most cleverly bundled warrior can catch the shivers. So how else did these stoic seafarers ward off hypothermia, frostbite, or the general depressing chill that comes from realizing you're hundreds of miles from home and your pillow is a coil of rope? They huddled. One of the great secrets of Viking ship life, besides which cousins snored loudest, was the quiet, practical art of communal body heat. They operated on a get over yourself and scoot closer philosophy. When bedtime came around, they laid side by side on their longship's deck, under shared cloaks or thick animal pelts, forming great human sausages of warmth, not particularly glamorous, extremely effective, but even more important than what they wore or where they cuddled was what they ate. Viking diets were strategically fatty. Butter, cheese, dried meats, and even fermented fish, delicious by their standards, nightmarishly pungent by ours. These weren't just fuel for battle cries. They were internal insulation. Fat stores kept bodies fueled, and kombucha-scented fish helped ensure personal space, unless it was cuddle o'clock. And while we're floating there on the ship for a moment, wind humming through the sails, salt drying on leather breastplates, it's worth noting that heat wasn't the only thing forbidden on board. Fire, in general, was considered a strict no-no on Viking longships. The reason is fairly straightforward. They were made entirely of wood, the flammable kind, having an open flame on a floating stick of timber. Even the most daring berserker knew that was more of a no thank you than a hold my mead. All cooking then was done before departure or during land stops. A pot of lamb stew might be prepared on the shore and packed in a lidded container for the next day's journey. No campfire ales brewed on board, no freshly toasted bread, just chilled leftovers and dreams of land. So how did Vikings survive freezing seas without fire? With thick wool, layered linen, sealed pouts, shared body heat, protestingly rich diets, and the grim satisfaction that everyone around them was just as cold and uncomfortable as they were. It was communal misery, wrapped in sheep. As the longship's keel cuts onward through the murk of a twilight sea, let us drift quietly, ever deeper, into the gentle rhythm of waves and wool. There is still much to learn in the Viking world, including what treasures, precisely, they smuggled in those suspicious-looking barrels. You might imagine Vikings wrapped in shining armor, howling into the storm, swinging axes through hurricanes like some sort of Norse action movie. But truth be told, real Viking life was a lot less epic saga, and a lot more cold wet socks and questionable fish stew. And if you're sitting there wondering whether they wore underpants, oh yes, we're going there. Now, freezing your knees off at sea for weeks on end teaches a person things. Chiefly, that you can't simply wait for a summer breeze to come wafting across the fjords. That sort of optimism tended to get you turned into a Viking cycle. So how did they stay warm, these sons and daughters of Odin, without a toasty fire roaring aboard their wooden ships? Because, and here's a spoiler that won't shake your soul, fires on wooden boats packed with sailcloth and tar aren't encouraged, unless you're interested in a very short voyage followed by screaming and splashing. Instead, Viking warmth came from layers, cleverness, and a touch of stubborn grit. Picture it. A lean, shaggy-bearded sailor swaddled like an onion. The innermost layer? Soft, undyed linen. Yes, linen. It may not sound cozy, but it wicks away moisture like a surprisingly judgmental tea towel. Wet wool saps warmth, but dry linen, that's your underlayer hero. On top of that came wool. Lots of wool. Thick, fuzzy, and often itchy in a way that builds moral character. Wool trousers, wool tunics, wool capes. Every Viking worth their salt probably smelled faintly of damp sheep. Not that anyone was smelling particularly fresh in those days. Shampoo hadn't made its way north just yet. And forget those winged helmets we've seen in cartoons. There is not one speck of evidence that Vikings ever wore wings on their heads. Most likely, they preferred baggy woolen hoods or sheepskin caps that covered their ears. They looked less like Thor, and more like the gloomy cousin of a garden gnome, but considerably warmer. Their boats, or longships, were not built for comfort. Open to the elements, they had no cozy below-decks lounge or hot drink service, not even a designated snuggling nook. Sailors slept under upturned shields or tucked beneath animal skins. If you ever napped under a piece of hard wood during a rainstorm, congratulations. You too can cosplay Viking leisure. We must, of course, mention the cloaks. Oh, the cloaks. These weren't fastened purely for fashion flair. Though it must be said, a nicely embroidered brooch did wonders for morale. Cloaks were made from heavy wool, sometimes lined with fur if you were lucky, or slightly royalty adjacent. They could double as blankets, or be worn over both shoulders like a makeshift sleeping bag. Think of it as Viking wearable tech. It didn't download podcasts, but it did keep your frostbitten elbows from falling off. Footwear. Functional chaos. They wore turn shoes, soft leather slip-ons tied around the ankles. Not exactly waterproof, but better than bare feet. Inside, probably wrappings of wool or fur. Not socks as we know them, but eternal gratitude was likely directed at any grandmother who could knit. And the fur. Ah yes. It turned out that when you're surrounded by foxes, squirrels, bears, and an honest-to-goodness surplus of sheep, there's no reason your wardrobe can't resemble a minor forest. Vikings weren't squeamish about skinning things. Fur-lined mittens, hats, and boots went a long way toward keeping you alive in sleet, snow, and suspicious sea spray. Of course, there's warmth, and then there's morale. You could wear as much wool as a small cottage, but if your spirits were freezing, that icy wind cut twice as deep. So what did Vikings do? They sang, chanting, rowing songs, verses about gods and trolls, and the occasional rude limerick, a kind of sonic sweater, if you will. And they huddled. Yes, Human body heat. Never undervalue the survival benefits of 6 burly sailors snuggled like sardines beneath a shared bearskin. That's not only friendship, that's efficient insulation. So no fire, but plenty of fire inside. The fire of clever practicality and a dash of rugged singing on the deck stoicism. Somewhere out there, under silver stars and icy winds, a Viking crew is tagging in for the night watch, wrapping cloaks tighter, pulling hoods low, and pressing close to stay warm. And just as the drums of oars thump like a heartbeat across black seawater, we begin to wonder, what exactly did they eat during these freezing voyages? Because a man cannot row on wool alone. Now picture this. A longship cuts through the North Atlantic like a knife through chilled butter. A dragon's head juts from the prow, snarling at the mist ahead. The sea hisses along the sides, icy spray freezing mid-air and leaving crusts of frost on every wooden post, beard, and eyebrow in sight. On board, 30 or so thoroughly unfazed Vikings. Bareheaded, some of them. This is not a group known for overreacting to weather. But here's the dreamy catch. They don't have a fire. Not on board. No glowing hearth on the deck. No neat little cauldron of stew warming their raven-pecked bones. Fire and wooden ships are, as it turns out, famously bad roommates. So how exactly did they keep their swagger and their toes from turning into icicles? The answer is part ingenuity, part biology, and part sheer Norse stubbornness resembling a particularly frosty form of optimism. Let's start with the wool. Sacred, scratchy, slightly damp wool. Viking-era Scandinavians were basically walking advertisements for sheep. Their undergarments, tunics, cloaks, socks, all woven from thick, oily wool, often from the rugged and magnificent short-tailed sheep of the north. These sheep were not interested in pampering humans. They were interested in surviving. Their wool, by extension, was built for rain, snow, and the casual surprise hailstorm. Unwashed wool retained its lanolin, a kind of natural water repellent that would make modern raincoats puff out an envious sigh. Vikings would layer their clothing smartly, tunic over shirt, trousers of wool wrapped snugly with leg bindings, long fabric strips crisscrossed down the shins like stylish insulation. Think ancient Scandinavia's version of fashion meets function. A Viking could take on a chilly wave and shrug half of it off before the moisture reached skin. Still, wool alone isn't enough when you're coasting over waves cold enough to convince seals to wear mittens. Here's where the design of the longship itself came to the rescue. These boats, while open to the air above, were cleverly constructed to shed water from the deck, and when anchored or beached for overnight stops, they'd be covered with tent-like awnings made from tarred canvas, animal hides, or both. These makeshift ship cabins kept the biting wind at bay, and inside them, furs, hay, and an ungodly number of blankets, all smelling faintly of adventure, axe polish, and fermented herring. At night, when they anchored or pulled ashore, the real warming happened. Vikings would build fires on solid land, if it was available, and dry their wet gear, cook and swap, exaggerated tales of conquest, or slightly misremembered stories about fighting 2 poultry-sized trolls beneath a mountain that might have been a hill. It was the warmth of camaraderie, yes, but also a tactical warming session before the next leg of the journey. Then, there's the human side of the equation, the biology of the beast. You see, these were not office workers suddenly thrust into Arctic kayaking. These were people hardened from birth by the climate, infants swaddled in wool before they could crawl toward danger, grown adults who treated frostbite the way we treat an inconvenient sniffle, Their bodies adapted. Metabolisms ran hot. Their diets, all that seal meat and pickled things, packed enough calories to stoke a good internal fire. And truth be told, movement helped too. Rowing isn't just for crossing quiet fjords with a picnic in mind. It's exercise. And exercise is heat with a side of sweat. One often overlooked strategy: sharing. Vikings slept densely packed, like history's first team-building retreat. When temperatures plummeted, they'd sleep side by side under layers of wool and fur, using body heat the way penguins do during blizzards, except with more tattoos and marginally less squawking. And perhaps, just perhaps, warming came from a different source too, from within. Pride, identity. A Viking wasn't just enduring the cold, he was conquesting across it. There is a peculiar kind of warmth that comes from feeling invincible, or at least hilariously stubborn in the face of a biting wind. Of course, there were still cold toes, chilled fingers, and nights when someone probably whispered, "Next time, let's pillage somewhere warmer." But if they did, they likely said it while gnawing on dried fish and chuckling softly into a woolen scarf. And so, the longships glided forward through sleet and song, barred from fire, but never from warmth. Just ahead lay new coasts, strange skies, and perhaps, just maybe, a clever solution to the next great frozen Viking mystery. As the black water curled on itself beneath a blanket of stars, Viking longships creaked quietly like old bones remembering youth. This was no summer voyage. The air bit at nostrils, the sort of cold that politely greets you with a handshake, then refuses to let go. And yet, somehow, these Norse mariners floated across the North Atlantic, wrapped not in shivers, but in strategy. Now picture this. It's the year 875, give or take a few Norse gods' birthdays. You're a hardened Viking sailor with cheeks like cured ham and a beard that could filter coffee. You're miles from shore. It's snowing sideways. And surprisingly, you are not frozen solid. Which brings us to tonight's frosty dilemma. How on earth did these people stay warm on open boats? No fire, no cabin. Not even the earthly comfort of a woolly hot water bottle shaped like Thor. Brevity is for the oxen. Let's unpack this. First, the clothes. Viking attire wasn't just stylish in that plunder chic way. It was practical, layered, and surprisingly cozy. Forget horned helmets, which, I'm sorry, were about as real as unicorn tax returns. The real fashion heroes were layers. Linen undergarments, woolen tunics, and cloaks so thick they could double as small roofs. Wool, ever the unsung hero of historical outerwear, was the textile of choice. Not merely because sheep were conveniently huggable, but because woven wool traps heat in millions of tiny air pockets. Like carrying around your own personal cloud, if your cloud was slightly itchy and smelled faintly of wet goat. And if you were truly fancy, like Olaf the Wealthy and Not Frozen Fancy, you might have worn garments trimmed with fur. Not just any fur, mind you. Arctic fox, beaver and bear made appearances in high-status wardrobes, not because Vikings were aspiring Bond villains, but because fur is nature's central heating system. A hood lined with bear fur didn't just say, "I'm warm." It also whispered, "Don't mess with me. I wrestled a bear for this look." But clothing was only Act 1. The real sorcery of Viking thermal management was something profoundly human. Body heat. Yes, dear dreamer, they huddled. No shame, no awkwardness. Just a dozen strong warriors spooning like undignified marshmallows to survive a North Sea gale. Modern scientists would call this communal thermoregulation. We would call it the Viking Snuggle. In the narrow belly of the longship, under decks rimed with salty frost, The crew would pile their bedding together. Thick wool blankets, sheepskins, maybe a moose hide or two if the hunting had been good and the moose had been inattentive. They'd lie shoulder to shoulder like sardines with swords, sharing heat, sharing dreams, and cultivating a strong immunity to personal space. Now, you might be wondering, and quite rightly so, about fire. Couldn't they just light a cozy blaze to toast their toes? Alas, fire and wooden ships make for a famously incompatible romance. There were no fireplaces aboard Viking longships, no cheery hearths crackling merrily under the stars. A single gust, and suddenly your beautiful hand-carved longboat becomes an expensive bonfire at sea. So no flames, unless you counted the fiery spirit of a crewman, denied his evening porridge. When they did dock or camp ashore, that was a different story. Then came the roaring campfires, the dry boots, and the steaming bowls of something fishy. But at sea, it was all about preparation, clever insulation, and the warm companionship of people who, while they might sleep with one eye open, knew that a little coal couldn't slow a Viking with the right layering system and a neighbour to lean into. For the especially crafty, or paranoid, some Viking ships were equipped with tents, small canvas-like shelters constructed over parts of the deck. These were not glamping affairs, mind you. No embroidered pillows or discreet minibar, just a bit of canvas stretched above the sleeping area to shield from snow, sleet, and the existential chill of the north wind's poetry. And let's not overlook diet. High-fat meals, whether salted pork, dried fish, or curiously resilient cheese, did their bit to fuel internal furnaces. The Vikings were walking chimneys of calorie combustion. Think of lard as the Vikings' thermal underwear. So between woolen cloaks, the sacred cuddle pile, and temperatures that were merely life-threatening rather than instantly fatal, our seafaring friends endured the cold with stoicism, strategy, and just a hint of reckless optimism. Slumber with that image. A midnight sea, the rhythmic creak of timber, the gentle snores of warriors cocooned in fur and comradeship. And as icy stars twinkle overhead, let us drift further into how they passed the long, dark hours when sleep and solitude met out on the waves. Nestled beneath the snow-heavy skies of the North Atlantic, the longship creaked like an old man settling into bed. It wasn't much warmer than a wooden bench at a frostbite convention, and yet the Vikings seemed oddly unfazed. Picture them. Skins wrapped tight, beards glistening with sea spray, and not a portable campfire in sight. One begins to wonder, were they born with lava instead of blood? Well, no. But they did have a few chilly tricks up their woolen sleeves. You see, fire aboard a ship made almost entirely of tarred wood, with sails spun from anger and hope, was generally frowned upon. Open flames and salty timber famously do not mix. So Viking ships, while marvelous engineering feats, were essentially floating kindling on a Viking-shaped spit. To stay warm during those long, bone-stiffening sea voyages, Vikings relied on a complex mixture of insulation, strategy, and surprisingly cozy fashion choices. First up, the humble undergarment. Before reaching for their iconic flashy cloaks and bear-slaying looks, a proper Norseman slipped into something a little more comfortable. Long woolen underwear, undyed and itchy as poor manners, made from the thick shagginess of local sheep, was their first line of defense. Over that came additional tunics, sometimes 2 or 3, layered like a human onion of chivalrous frostbite prevention. Cloaks and capes followed, often fastened with ornate brooches, not just for style, but also to keep the wind from playing peekaboo with one's vital organs. But where did they get such warmth in the first place? Enter the sheep, specifically the Icelandic sheep, fluffy creatures responsible for most of the warmth that clung to Norse backsides. Their wool, so dense and warm it made other wool feel insecure, could trap heat while bravely facing sea spray and mournful northern gusts. Viking women, masters of spinning and weaving, turned this wool into garments that were less like clothes and more like wearable hearths. Now, perhaps the most underrated Viking invention wasn't a warship or a method of aquavit fermentation, but the hood. Known as a coif or hooded cowl, it was the sun hat of the subarctic sea. These head coverings wrapped snugly around the dome, often long enough to tuck into the tunic, deflecting cold drafts before they could plot mischief down one's neckline. The beard, too, served as natural insulation, a living scarf grown with pride and never trimmed except by sword accident. And the boots, oh the boots, sealed with sealskin or layered with felt and fur, they had more in common with survival capsules than shoes. Think of a foot being hugged by an Arctic fox that really believes in you. At night, when the knife-edge chill of the ocean air bit hardest, Vikings knew how to huddle. Not just emotionally, though they did have strong social ties and strong social smells. Sleep on a longship happened beneath benches, amid supplies and shields, the hull filled with sacks of hay-stuffed bedding wrapped in furs. Each crewman turned into a sort of hibernating hedgehog. Vikings took warmth from each other and from the promise of land in the distance, warming up with dreams of mead and overcooked goat. Of course, humour was another source of heat. There may not be archaeological proof, but one suspects that a good old Norse roast, teasing a friend about the ice in his beard or the squeaky tone of his war cry, provided just enough laughter to keep the soul from icing over. And perhaps the true secret to Viking warmth wasn't physical at all. It lay somewhere between the courage of sailing toward the unknown and the stubborn refusal to let weather win. After all, once you've shouted into the frozen wind wearing only a wool tunic and a beard full of snorticles, the cold doesn't bother you quite so much anymore. So the next time you tuck yourself in under 5 blankets, just because your toes got chilly on the walk from the fridge, consider the Viking, sailing into winter's jaw with sheep on his back and determination in his step. And speaking of determination, it might just be time to pull back the woolen curtain on how Vikings managed to dry those sodden, salty clothes without the luxury of a tumble dryer, or indeed, much sunlight at all. On the open sea, where the stars blinked like frostbitten candles and the wind had an opinion about everything, the Vikings floated like shaggy, sea-going porcupines, bristling with furs, oars, and opinions of their own. They called their longships draka, which sounds fierce, and admittedly helped distract from the fact that, for all their intimidating prow beasts carved out of wood, it was essentially a glorified canoe with commitment issues. And oh, the cold. The kind of cold that made your thoughts freeze mid-sentence. The kind where eyebrows turned into brittle sculptures, and even Odin himself might have requested a second scarf. But fire? No, sir. Fire on a wooden ship filled with tar, pitch, and dreams. Bad idea. The Vikings, for all their axe-flinging, flair, had an admirable sense of self-preservation. So instead of crackling hearths, they relied on something older and furrier, the generous, unblinking contribution of Icelandic sheep. Sheep were their secret weapon. Not in battle, although a particularly annoyed ram might disagree, but in keeping snug from prow to stern. The wool was dense, oily, and pleasantly immune to North Sea tantrums. Thanks to the magic of lanolin, Viking cloaks repelled rain with the smug satisfaction of a well-oiled duck. They didn't waterlog so much as glisten patriotically. Each warrior might have looked ready for a sauna rave, layered in tunics of undyed wool, leggings that were suspiciously similar to shaggy long johns, and cloaks enormous enough to double as emergency tents, or, if the night went well, group blankets. Beneath those cloaks was often another defense mechanism, the ever-important undergarment made of linen. Yes, linen, breathable during battle, but equally useful when swaddled inside all that sheep fuzz. Picture it, a Viking warrior feared across Europe for his pillaging enthusiasm, delicately tidying his linen underpants between raids. History can be soothing like that. Every Viking ship had the scent of adventure, ambition, and probably damp wool. There was no getting around it. With the sea mist collecting in beards and sails alike, the longship smelled like a thrift shop in a rainstorm. But to them, it was the fragrance of determination. And as for bedding, ah yes, bedding. When night fell and the sails were furled, and the crew bunched together on deck like a well-armed litter of puppies, they'd curl up in communal nests. The human version of penguin formations. They didn't mind it. Keeping warm wasn't just strategy. It was survival by snuggle. Ironically, the same men who could swing a battle axe through a door frame with frightening accuracy were rather cuddly in a draft. Fall asleep near the windward side of the ship, and you might find yourself spooned by Eric the Red before sunrise. Not so much romantic as pragmatic, which is how most Viking interactions went anyway. Occasionally, they'd bring along moss-stuffed bedrolls or rough-hewn pads made from straw sacks lined with more wool or fur. These modest squishy rectangles offered a small break from sleeping directly on coils of rope or a bearded crewmate. But if the sea was choppy, forget it. You'd be cuddling and airborne simultaneously. You might also wonder, what about boots? Surely their feet must have frozen inside those leather hooves. Ah, no. Viking boots were soft-soled, high-ankled wonders, lined with fur and stitched tighter than Grandma's knitting circle. They'd stuff straw or more wool inside, anything to buy their freezing toes a little longer lease on life. Some even swore by wrapping feet in dry grass, which might sound silly until you remember we're talking about people who sailed across oceans wearing sheep and faith. There was one other warming device worth mentioning though, and it was probably the most effective of all: stories. Yes, around murmured tales shared under the sputtering stars, huddled between two horns of ale, Vikings would speak of gods and monsters, of lands rich with gold and warmer breezes, of home. And in those tales, the cold would lean back a little, give them room to breathe. They knew full well that warmth didn't always come from fire. Sometimes it came layered in wool, closed in by laughter, and sealed with the promise of morning. And speaking of promises, our next stop finds us not on the deck of a longship, but beneath the earth, where Vikings found warmth by building underground. Yes, it's time we met the turf house, cozy, grassy, and highly flammable. What could possibly go wrong? Longboats slicing through misty fjords might sound romantic, in a rugged, windburn sort of way. But let's be honest, riding waves in an open wooden tub through frozen seawater doesn't exactly scream warm and cozy. It whispers hypothermia in Norse. Still, the Vikings weren't fools, nor were they impervious ice demons, despite what television dramas and questionable tattoos may lead us to believe. They felt the chill. They grumbled about the wind, and they spent generations perfecting strange and clever techniques to survive the cold. All without the blazing benefit of an onboard fire. First, let's talk cloaks. Not just any cloaks, bear fur, wolfskin, thick tufted sheep's wool cloaks that hung heavy and proud like a personal storm cloud of warmth. Vikings dressed to impress, yes, but mainly to survive. A well-layered Norseman could turn a howling North Sea squall into background ambience. Wool was their favorite fabric, natural, insulating, and crucially, it stayed warm even when wet, which is essential when the splash zone actually refers to 97% of your voyage. Beneath those cloaks, many Vikings wore inner garments fashioned from linen or thinner wool, a sort of medieval thermal layer. Think of it as Arctic loungewear, designed less for style and more for not turning into a bearded icicle before reaching your pillaging appointment. Boots, of course, stuffed with moss or straw sometimes. Yes, straw. Because what better to keep your toes toasty than bits of dry grass artfully crammed into goatskin boots? It may not be fashion forward, but when the sea sprays hitting like winter soup in the face, insulation wins over elegance. And herein lies the cunning part. Body heat. Yes, reader, or rather, listener. The human furnace. A Viking longship held dozens of people. Cram them aboard shoulder to shoulder, throw in a few crates of salted fish, some snarling dogs, and one moody raven perched ominously on the mast, and you've got yourself a floating, slightly smelly sauna. Though perhaps not the eucalyptus-scented sort found in fancy spas today. Their ships, long and open though they were, sat low in the water with minimal decking. But clever carpentry played a part in staying dry and insulated. Some ships were fitted with removable awnings, animal hides stretched and lashed over beams, forming tented shelters for rest and warmth. These makeshift canvases also offered a measure of respite from the incessant spray. Not perfect, but certainly better than Viking shampoo, otherwise known as whatever blows in from the sea. Some sagas even mention warriors wrapping their bedrolls in oiled cloth for waterproofing. And yes, that's as unpleasantly damp sounding as it appears, but desperate times call for clammy measures. Now, without fire, how did they prepare warm food or drink on these long journeys? Here lies the uncomfortable truth. They usually didn't. Before setting sail, Viking travelers would pack their provisions with the cold in mind. Hard bread, smoked or dried meat, and dried fish, often haddock or cod. These sturdy staples could outlast even a blushless Scandinavian winter. For liquid warmth, they relied on mead, ale, and sometimes fermented milk. Probably not the most comforting cup of cocoa, but it did offer a bit of fearless cheer. Picture this: a weary Norseman squinting through a snow-spitting horizon, sipping sour goat milk and muttering solemnly about Thor's indifference. Charming. For sleep, when they took shifts napping in the boat, they'd lie atop their shields, which offered a barrier from the cold deck boards underneath. It wasn't plush, but it was practical. Viking bedrooms, you see, were less five-star luxury and more strategically cushioned plank. There's even evidence that some native northern peoples, possibly influencing Viking habits, used body wrapping methods at night, rolling up in wool and furs as tightly as seaweed sushi. Human-sized burritos in the fjord. Strangely adorable. Possibly quite itchy. So no, the ICC didn't turn the Norse into frozen statues. It simply taught them to move, to layer, to pack smart, and to lean, quite literally, on each other for warmth. A longship rising and dipping in rhythm with the waves, the wind howling like a mead-fueled ghost, and snoring warriors dreaming of warm hearths on land. despite having no such luxury on board. And just as one frostbitten solution finished wrapping itself in bear hide, another loomed cold and clever on the horizon. Just as dawn's grey brush gently touched the ice-spattered sails of a Viking longship, the North Sea exhaled another sleepy, salt-frosted sigh. For the average Viking warrior, tattoos peeking from under sealskin cloaks, hair braided like woodland rivers, this wasn't particularly unusual. After all, if you've sailed past icebergs wearing trousers mostly stitched from goat bits, your expectations for daily comfort are, shall we say, modest. And yet, they remained surprisingly warm, almost suspiciously so. It wasn't magic, it wasn't dragon fire. And no, they didn't travel with little smouldering hearths strapped to their backs. The secret, dear dreamer, lies in their unholy partnership with a very specific kind of stink. Let's begin with the undergarments, a word which at the time really just meant whatever's under whatever. Vikings layered their clothing in a system that would make a modern hiker nod in slow respect. Closest to the skin were under-tunics made of finely combed wool or linen, if they hadn't bartered all their linen for mead again, which happened often. Wool, with its miraculous sheep-derived heat preservation properties, was the real star. It's breathable, it's insulating, and most importantly, it could stay sort of warm even when damp. And dear listener, in Viking life, everything was always at least a little damp. Over the base layers, you'd pile tunics of rougher wool, sometimes lined with fur from beasts of disputed origin. Some wore trousers with foot wrappings made from felted wool, all cinched with leather ties and sheer Nordic stubbornness. Cloaks, typically fastened at one shoulder with an impressively forged brooch, were the ultimate accessory, and also acted like wearable tents that doubled as bedding. Imagine wearing a small, bristling carpet that smelled faintly of wet elk and heroism. That's the Viking aesthetic. Now, let's talk boots. Viking footwear may not have survived Fashion Week, but it certainly outlived most of its wearers. Crafted from turned leather and stuffed with hay or moss, yes, actual moss, boots were practical, squishy affairs that could be dried over a fire and reused until they disintegrated into historical artifacts. Still, keeping warm wasn't just about the clothes, it was about movement. Viking longships weren't cozy lounges, they were glorified floating benches with sails. If you wanted to stay warm, you rowed, and you rowed. And oh yes, you rowed some more. The constant labour not only propelled the ship across leagues of gusting sea, but also kept your muscles from becoming frozen exhibits. Even at night time, the body heat and collective huddling of the crew served as an impromptu heating system. Remember, 25 burly Danes snuggled under fur cloaks radiate roughly the same thermal energy as a campfire and smell occasionally similar. There was no privacy on these ships, but there was also no frostbite, a small price perhaps. But here's a dreamy nugget you may not have heard. Vikings were connoisseurs of grease. Not the Mediterranean kind, mind you. No olive oil spas and hummus platters here. The Norse coated exposed skin with animal fat, typically bear or seal, to insulate against biting wind. It was waterproof, windproof, and impressively, snackable in emergencies. One can imagine a Viking gingerly patting his cheek only to mutter, bit of otter left. And then there was the curious matter of the hat. A warm hat, for the Viking, was not horned. Let's gently demystify this part. Nobody wore horned helmets besides modern costume enthusiasts, and perhaps a confused Swedish opera singer or two. Instead, knitted wool caps, felted hoods, or even simple scarves wrapped around the head and neck kept out the worst of the polar kiss. In the ferocious winters near the Arctic Circle, these garments were less fashion and more survival. Did they ever get frostbite? Almost certainly. Did they complain? Possibly, though Viking sagas are notoriously short on entries titled "Odin, my toes are cold." But the sheer grit involved in crossing glacial waters in homespun wool, reeled together with bone needles and defiant hope, can make even your warmest modern blanket feel a bit underwhelming by comparison. So, as you drift beneath your comforter, tucked into your climate-controlled room, you can close your eyes and thank a greasy, moss-shoed Viking. He rode through sleet so you could snooze at 72 degrees with a heating pad. But the high seas offered more than goose-down-free warmth. Just over the horizon, as storms brew and sailcloth flaps like the wings of ancient seabirds, there waits an even more curious tale. One involving cabin fever, sagas, and suspicious quantities of dried fish. Far away from the roaring hearths of Viking longhouses, where smoke curled like old stories into the rafters and warmth wrapped the toes of warriors and weavers alike, there lay the icy stretch of open sea, a place that made goosebumps just by looking at it too long. And yet, Vikings sailed across it, not once, not twice, again and again. These burly boat lovers launched themselves into the frozen North Atlantic as casually as you or I might step outside to check the mail, except instead of slippers and a robe, they wore layers of wool, a general lack of fear, and quite possibly unreasonable optimism. You see, if you were lucky enough to be a passenger on a dragon-headed longship, skimming the white-crested waves, you might reasonably ask, "Excuse me, where's the fireplace?" To which the burliest Viking would probably grunt and gesture vaguely toward the sky, as though warmth might be cloud-based. In reality, their little wooden ships had no fire on board, not unless they were on their way to burn something. Hearths belonged at home, where they didn't threaten to burn 12 meters of pine to the waterline. So, how did they stay warm? Well, the answer lies in a romantic Nordic marriage between good wool and grim determination. Vikings layered themselves like a historical onion. Linen undergarments crowned with thick wool tunics, cloaks fastened with brooches, and sometimes even an extra layer of fur, just in case the wind got ideas. Wool, natural, insulating, and suspiciously gifted at retaining warmth even when wet, was their secret weapon. Viking wool was not your fancy holiday sweater sort, mind you. It was coarse, sturdy, the sort of fabric that could survive a hailstorm and then be used as sandpaper in a pinch. It also breathed, which is more than could be said for most things on these voyages after day 4 of dried fish. Now, when the north wind gave them a slap across the face, and it often did, the fur-lined hood of their cloaks would be drawn up and layers tugged tighter. They'd cluster together on the open deck, seated like puffins in formation, conserving every bit of heat in communal body huddles that were possibly as emotionally awkward as they were thermally effective. They may not have had cruise ship comforts, but they brought other things. Thick sheepskin mittens, hand-stitched boots packed with straw for insulation, and occasionally, when conditions were polite enough, a simple woolen blanket passed shoulder to shoulder. And of course, they had movement. Rowing, bailing out water, yelling at things in Old Norse, and the general business of seafaring, all find ways to generate heat and pass the time while slowly freezing on the briny deep. But the true miracle lay in their heads. No, really, Viking hats. Contrary to popular belief, Viking helmets did not have horns. Putting horns on your helmet is a great way to get stuck in doorways and develop an early neck cramp. Instead, their everyday sea hats were of a more sensible stitch. Woolen caps, often shaped like inverted teacups, sometimes lined with fur, snug as a mother's blessing. With ears covered and spirits bolstered by epic sagas whispered under breath and the faint promise of eventual breakfast, they pressed forward across waters that have given many a warm-blooded soul second thoughts. And what about sleep? Ah yes, try grabbing a nap while the North Atlantic sprays your face with salt and regret. On overnight journeys, when the wind allowed it, they'd bed down under tarpaulins stitched of wool and sealskin, bracing for dreams interrupted by rolling waves and creaky wooden complaints. A fur cloak under you, a woolen cloak over you, and the general emotional scar tissue of seafaring machismo. Cozy enough, if you squint. There were, of course, songs. Always songs. Not the sort to summon cannons or chase off pirates, but deep-throated choral rhythms to synchronize rowing, warm the lungs, and distract from the slow frostbite nibbling at unsuspecting toes. Sometimes poems were shared in the dark, tales of Odin and sleighs drawn by goats. Not reindeer, mind you, because who needs hooves when there are horns? And speaking of horns, not the kind from helmets, but the kind for drinking, there may well have been a sip of mead passed around, honey and herbs warming the belly, while the mind drifted toward home shores, glowing hearths, and the wonderful, wonderful concept of socks. Somehow, through wool and willpower, they weathered it all. Bearded silhouettes on the ice-bitten horizon, chasing dreams not of comfort, but of discovery. Now, as the stars tilt slightly above the sail, and the cold deep around the boat murmurs softly like an old lullaby sung by fjords, let's ease into the quiet company of the ship's creaking timbers, and perhaps, just perhaps, drift into what else they carried with them across the sea. If you happen to be afloat on a Viking longship somewhere near the frosty fjords of late 9th century Scandinavia, you might be tempted to ask the obvious question, perhaps in a polite whisper, so as not to offend anyone currently gnawing on dried fish. Why on Odin's chilly beard didn't these seafaring warriors put a fire on board? The short answer is wood burns, and Viking longships, sleek, hand-carved marvels of marine engineering, were made almost entirely of, yes, wood. Even Vikings, for all their bristling bravado and helmetless heads, knew better than to start a cozy campfire in the middle of their own flotation device. Fire and ship planking were, shall we say, on poor social terms. But this raises a more pressing question for our midnight musing. If they couldn't light fires on deck, and the North Sea winds were blowing their usual unsolicited Arctic drafts into everyone's nostrils, how in the name of Thor's missing hammer did the Vikings stay warm? Let us drift for a moment into the folds of wool and the whispers of fur. Vikings, you see, were textile aficionados in their own rugged way, especially when it came to wool. The sheep of Scandinavia produced a thick, oily kind of wool, heavy with lanolin, which not only kept water out like a stubborn troll at a wedding, but also retained warmth even when wet. Homespun, handwoven, and often dyed in deep earthy tones, these woolen garments were layered like a good lasagna. Base tunic, over tunic, cloaks, hats, mittens, even socks. Yes, Viking socks, often null-bound, a cousin of knitting that predates even your great-aunt's craft circle. And then there were cloaks, long, rectangular, and pinned at the shoulder with a brooch that could double as a makeshift pancake flipper in emergencies. A particularly heavy woolen cloak might feel like draping yourself in a portable sauna made of itchy clouds. Not exactly luxury, but certainly effective when the wind howled and the sea hissed. But fabric wasn't their only trick. Fur was a prized commodity too, especially for lining boots or the edges of cloaks. Reindeer, bear, fox, creatures rather less enthusiastic about contributing to Viking fashion than the stylish Norse folks were about wearing them. The elite even wore ermine, that dainty little predator that looks like it was designed by someone trying to imagine a tube sock with teeth. As for sleeping arrangements on open-deck voyages, far from plush. At night, Vikings would huddle for warmth, sometimes 2 or 3 to a sleeping space under shared cloaks and furs. Privacy was as rare as fresh apples in midwinter. If you were fortunate, the trip was short. If not, you learned to appreciate your neighbor's body heat, however questionable their hygiene. Of course, the ultimate heating system was neither wool nor fox fur, but the sheer caloric energy of being perpetually busy. Rowing, pulling, lines, adjusting sails, shouting battle cries into the indifferent wind, all excellent cardiovascular options. Constant motion meant your blood kept pumping, your extremities remained attached, and your internal organs stayed delightfully unfrozen. Warmth also came in the form of food and drink. A hearty stew brewed back on shore might be spooned up on deck from portable containers, thick with barley and bits of salted meat. And let's not forget mead, a sort of Viking energy drink made from fermented honey. Though frankly, a couple of gulps of that, and you might forget the cold altogether, along with your last 3 ancestors and possibly your own name. Interestingly, they also believed in magical protection from the elements. Runes carved into necklaces, charms sewn into clothing, or even a whispered spell could serve as psychological insulation. While modern science might look askance at this, anyone who's ever worn a lucky sweater on a chilly date understands the basic principle. So no fire, but warmth, absolutely. The Vikings layered their fabrics, their furs, their movements, and even their beliefs to survive, or at least shiver more poetically, beneath cold northern skies. As we sail gently into quieter waters, picture a crew wrapped in wool, leaning into wind and wave, cloaked in fog, drifting between ice-tipped waves and myth. The crackle of fire nowhere to be found, yet their determination glowing brighter than any ember. And just ahead, the waves whisper tales of long-lost recipes, steaming stews in carved wooden bowls, and what exactly the Vikings considered comfort food when the sun refused to rise. Far out in the frostbitten fingers of the North Atlantic, the sea rolled like an unsettled dream, and the Viking ships, sleek, snub-nosed marvels of goatskin engineering, bobbed along with their dragon-headed dignity intact. Imagine it, 40 men, bristling with beards, swords, and the general stubbornness of Norsemen, crossing an ocean that had no interest in being hospitable. And yet, no fire. Not on the longboats, at least. You'd think someone would have written a very stern letter to the Viking Safety Committee about that. But you see, fire and Viking ships weren't the best of companions. Longships were made of wood. Their sails were thick wool, and their cargo, not just iron blades and salted fish, but also an inconvenient tendency to ignite if some overzealous warrior decided to warm his frozen fingers over an open flame. Thus, fire was banned from the decks mid-voyage. Instead, the Vikings turned to far fluffier methods of survival. First, there was the age-old warrior's secret, layering. Viking clothing was essentially medieval Scandinavian lasagna. The average Norseman wore at least 3 layers, an inner linen tunic, an outer wool one, and over that, perhaps a fur cloak traded from a passing bear or rival chieftain. Wool, being the superhero textile of the Middle Ages, kept them warm even when wet, which, let's be honest, was often. Arctic wind, sea spray, and the occasional wave leaping onto the deck like an over-eager sea dog. None of this could pierce the solemn layers of Viking fashion. Then came the blankets. Not just any blankets. These were mighty textile burritos of tightly woven wool and fur. Picture a horde of burly seafarers huddled together under a communal pile of fur throws, muttering epics and complaints into their beards. Cozy? Perhaps. Dignified? Debatable. But warmth in those days wasn't just about fabric sciences. It was also about caloric conviction. The Norse consumed a staggering amount of meat and fat, mostly dried or salted, and chased it down with ale, mead, or, in moments of bracing optimism, a fish stew that tasted like ambition and seawater. Fat, as it turns out, was more than just tasty. It insulated from the inside out. They were, in essence, heating themselves like well-fed otters. And we mustn't forget another vital ingredient in the Viking warmth arsenal: proximity. It's no secret that body heat shared is body heat earned. Below the deck, or more accurately, beneath some hide tarp lashed down to ward off wind, Vikings huddled together while taking shifts rowing. It wasn't glamorous, and there was certainly no personal space clause in the Viking code of conduct, but it worked. Men leaned against each other for heat, for camaraderie, and very often for lack of a better idea. Occasionally, a hardy soul would even cuddle with the livestock. Chickens were common passengers, feathered alarm clocks and egg dispensers. But when things got really cold, a man might spend an uncomfortable hour sharing warmth with the ship's goat, a furry, mildly judgmental foot warmer. Oh, and there's the famed Viking sweat ritual, saunas. Not exactly ship-safe, but as soon as they hit land, even if only a miserable patch of moss-laced rock, the first priority wasn't always pillaging. It was steam. Vikings built bathhouses and saunas everywhere from Iceland to Kiev, using hot stones and water to create a steaming sanctuary. After weeks at sea, shivering in their woolen leg braces and possibly cuddling a chicken, a sauna must have felt like Thor's own hug. But on the icy sea, far from such comforts, Vikings relied not on fires, but on their ingenuity, their layers, their goats, and perhaps most importantly, their sheer refusal to let the cold defeat them. They were a people who looked the north wind in the eye and said, "Is that all you've got?" And as they pressed on through the snowy silence of northern seas, under skies churning with slow grey clouds and the distant promise of auroras, they sang songs, exchanged tales, and even recited bits of poetry. For nothing warms the soul quite like words, well chosen. Which brings us gently to another curiosity of Viking lore. Not about ships or sails, but about silks. Yes, silks, and why these chilly warriors seemed awfully fond of them. But that's a tale for another cozy moment. For now, let the cold waves quiet and the oars fall still in your imagination. Out there on the chilled waters, where Norse longships carved lines through the slate-grey sea like etchings on a cold stone, the Vikings learned to become artisans of warmth without flame. And not the type of warmth that comes from a campfire's crackle. No, that sort of thing was generally frowned upon aboard a ship made incidentally of very flammable things. You may be wondering how sails billowed, oars splashed, and men hummed along under a sky prone to snow without the reprieve of fire. The short answer is layers. The longer answer is an alarmingly cozy but very itchy strategy involving wool, body heat, oil, and what I can only describe as a suspiciously cheerful view of discomfort. Wool, always wool. Viking clothing was engineered not just with survival in mind, but with the sort of optimism that says, this will itch horribly, but you won't die. They produced their garments from the wool of the sturdily indifferent sheep that roamed Scandinavian hillsides. Sheep that seemed just as unfazed by freezing gales as the people wearing their former coats. Most good Viking sailors began with a snug-fitting undertunic and layered upwards, spooling themselves into thick outer tunics, cloaks fastened with ornate brooches, and trousers sometimes treated with fish oil for waterproofing. And yes, while that sounds like a functional idea, you must remember that fish oil has never smelled like anything other than regret. They wrapped their legs with winningers, long strips of wool wound like bandages, turning their calves into something closer to wearable sausages. These acted like compression socks, only made centuries ahead of their time and without any regard for marketing. Add leather boots, often lined with fur, and mittens that looked like your hands had stolen a pair of tiny sleeping bags. Vikings took the art of mummifying oneself against the cold very seriously. But the finest furnace around was human companionship. The men aboard these longships huddled for warmth beneath the deck's low shelter boards, piled like logs, their breath mingling in clouds thick enough to mistake for passing fog. There is, tucked somewhere in that picture, a cozy sort of brotherhood, one where your fellow sailor's foot doubling as a pillow is simply an unspoken agreement. The ships had no stoves, no fire pits, just cunning engineering. Decks included small raised platforms under which cargo could be stored, and those same nooks served as sleeping quarters and windbreaks. Body heat was trapped there, conserved cunningly, as if the Vikings had read up on insulation decades before it was a polite subject in building manuals. To stave off the brutal damp, sailors rubbed themselves with animal fats that helped seal out the wind and water. A viscous, glistening barrier, equal parts practical and unappealing. It made Viking skin dewy before dewy was fashionable. So when you get cold on your ski holiday and reach for another hot cocoa, remember that your Norse forebears were climbing into blubber-slathered mittens and snuggling next to Sven, the human radiator, and meals warmed back at camp stayed warm in their bellies. A daily dose of hot broth or boiled grains could fortify a sailor for hours. Vikings often carried little leather pouches filled with dried meats, nuts, and other trail-ready fare, which, given the typical sea air ambience, could be described as rustic charcuterie on the go. Their minds helped heat them too. Chants, songs, and stories worked like a psychological hearth. Picture a group of shaggy figures in a longboat, rowing in rhythm, humming low ballads of Thor's thundering appetite and Loki's catty escapades. Music, especially communal singing, can raise morale and with it, body temperature. Science says so, and so did Bjorn apparently, who had an instinct for geology and tempo. The truth is, surviving the cold wasn't all grim determination and codfish layering. It was ritual, rhythm, a well-worn dance with discomfort that made men stronger, stories longer, and sagas worth telling. And as their sails caught the night breeze and the stars above scattered like frost across the heavens, the Vikings beneath bearskin cloaks and itchy tunics exhaled the warmth of life into the darkness. In the distance, quiet drums of thunder echo across a distant fjord. An omen, perhaps, or maybe just the sound of an old god clearing his throat. But that is a tale to drift into next. Even in their proudest sagas, the Vikings rarely paused to describe what happened when someone's toes went numb. The Skalds were too busy glorifying swordplay and ship hauling to mention toe-tingling frostbite. But let me tell you, stoicism only goes so far when your underpants are frozen. Let's slip quietly aboard a longship now, somewhere off the coast of fjord-woven Norway. The winter wind is giving its usual performance, booming bravado straight from Jotunheimer's lungs. The sea slaps cold mist over the deck, and each icy droplet seems to whisper, "You should have stayed in bed." But did the Vikings complain? Perhaps only rarely, and only in private. Perhaps when no seagulls were listening. It's easy to imagine these warriors of the north hewing through frost as they did foes, undaunted, unflinching. But the truth resembles a slightly soggy wool blanket, and possibly an old sock. Now, it's worth remembering that the Vikings, for all their thunder god thumping and berserker bellowing, were practical people. Picture a Viking captain, not snarling or roaring, but tucking a fur-lined hood a bit tighter around his ears, adjusting sealskin mittens, and trying not to sneeze too loudly lest he encourage the rest of the crew. Wool, deliciously itchy and beholden to the noble sheep, was their secret weapon, not the flimsy stuff your aunt knits into scarves that stretch like wet spaghetti. No, Viking wool was lovingly abused, soaked, stomped, stretched, and shrunk until it was dense enough to repel both wind and good conversation. This process, called fulling, gave the cloth enough integrity to withstand Baltic gusts and the occasional sea serpent. And beneath all that, more wool. Layers of it. Tunics, trousers, stocking-type leg wraps called puttees. An entire wardrobe hidden under armor and attitude. Men and women both wrapped themselves in so many layers that toppling over must have been both inevitable and softly cushioned. Then there was fur. Reindeer, fox, bear. Just about anything that came with a built-in coat soon found itself drafted into service. Viking cloaks, often lined with fur and clasped securely at the shoulder with decorative brooches, functioned like personal tents. A good cloak could protect you not just from winter's wrath, but also from nosy questions. Pull it tight enough, and no one knows whether you're silently composing poetry or asleep on a barrel of dried herring. But here's where things get especially cozy. The sleeping situation on board the ships. You might think they'd all sleep huddled in piles like large, unpleasantly scented dogs. Sometimes they did, but more often, Vikings brought along bedding, animal skins, perhaps even a pillow if one was feeling particularly fancy. They'd stretch a hide across a shield for a makeshift shelter, or tuck into niches below deck if the ship had one. And what a fire, you ask? Aha. Lighting a fire on a wooden ship, full of pitch and dreams, is generally discouraged, unless your dream is to have an impromptu Viking barbecue. So instead, they relied on another ancient secret, the body heat of grudging friendship. Cuddling, not officially, but strategic huddling for thermodynamic efficiency certainly happened. And surely, in those long northern nights, after the third round of salted fish, and the fifth ceaseless story about a cousin who nearly saw an elf once, someone reached for a reindeer pelt and pulled it over 2 shoulders instead of just one. Oh, and socks. Viking socks, knitted in the knoll binding method, which involved a single needle and the patience of a fjord. These socks weren't delicate. They were foot fortresses. Some archaeological finds suggest multiple sock layers, like nesting dolls of toe insulation. Still, certain parts remained cold. Noses reddened, beards frosted, and occasionally dignity vaporized when someone slipped on frozen fish innards. But through clever layering, cunning natural materials, and a cheerful disregard for temperature-based common sense, they managed. Imagine the morning after a freezing sail, as pale light breaks over the horizon and the crew uncurl stiffly from their fur cocoon. Someone coughs dramatically. Another finds that his moustache has frozen to a piece of salted pork. There's grumbling, yes, but also laughter. Some fool sings a lullaby in Old Norse. It sounds entirely out of tune and entirely perfect. And as they roll up their cloaks, shake the ice from their tunics, and prepare to brave another icy day at sea, they might share a secret look or two. A silent agreement that surviving frostbite together, with a sock-covered toe still intact, was heroic enough. Now, as dawn rises slowly over those misty northern waters, our sails billow slightly with the promise of a new tale. Not of wool or weather, but of something even stranger. Viking hygiene. Or, well, the noble attempt at it, somewhere in the North Atlantic, where mist kisses the lips of longships and the cold wraps itself around every bone like a clingy frost blanket. There drifted Viking sailors, warm in body, if not so much in attitude. How, you might ask, as you snuggle a little deeper under your blanket? Weren't they constantly freezing? And dear drowsy listener, you wouldn't be wrong to wonder. But tonight, let's ponder one of the warmest secrets of the coldest people. Their travel-sized portable cuddle engines, known to scholars and livestock counters alike as sheep. Yes, tonight, we set our sleepy compass toward the fleecy wonders of Norse wool culture, a surprisingly cozy place for our dreams to drift. Now, when you picture Vikings crossing wild seas, you might think of roaring beards, icy spray, and at least one person yelling about Valhalla. But while Hollywood shows us shirtless warriors, the truth was slightly more layered. Literally. The Viking experience came wrapped in wool piled on wool, possibly topped with a slightly grouchy lamb. Wool was the Norse people's miracle fibre, moisture-wicking, insulating even when wet, and capable of being woven into just about everything except a personality. Cloaks, tunics, trousers, socks so thick they could count as roommates. It was all wool. Viking crews didn't just dress for the weather, they conquered it by sheer fabric volume. And the wool itself came from an ancient breed of sheep, known charmingly as the spelsow. These weren't your modern fluffball sheep. No, the spelsow had short tails, double coats, and an attitude that said, "I see that frostbite, and I raise you a shrug." Their fleece had both long, stiff outer hairs to block wind and a soft underlayer that trapped warmth close to the skin. Basically, each sheep was wearing its own outerwear and thermals. Very meta. Before setting sail, Vikings would shear these sheep, spin the wool by hand, usually with drop spindles, and weave it into sailcloth as well as clothing. Yes, that's right, wool sails. Heavier than the standard linen of other seafarers, but tougher, hardier, and better at handling northern weather tantrums. Who needs speed when you've got insulation? Sailing slowly but comfortably was the true Viking vibe. Speedy frostbite is for amateurs. And speaking of those sails, here's a delightful little thought. Dried lanolin-rich wool isn't just water-resistant, it smells deeply and perpetually of sheep. Now imagine being on a boat, wrapped in sheep-smelling robes, under sheep-smelling sails, next to people who may also be wearing day-old sheep-based fashion. It was less a voyage and more a moving petting zoo, but with axes. And yes, lanolin. That's the other Viking wardrobe wizardry. This natural oil, secreted by sheep to waterproof their wool, stayed in their garments like a quiet force field. Lanolin coats the fibers, helping repel water and act as a barrier against wind. And as a bonus, depending on your olfactory courage, it also preserved the garments against mildew. Smelled a bit like a damp barn, but you stayed dry, and that was the main thing. Layering techniques were serious business too. A woolen undershirt, tunic on top, thick trousers, leg wraps spiraling up like sleepy licorice, and a heavy cloak clasped snugly at the chest. Even their hats, yes, actual warm hats, not the comic horned helmets, were made of felted wool or fur. If you think a Viking would board a ship hatless in Norway in February, then you, dear listener, have overestimated their recklessness and underestimated their ears. All this warmth was not just about staying cozy, it was a matter of survival. An icy longship breeze could slice through pride faster than a berserker through a buffet line. Of course, not everything was about wool. Sometimes, for the posh Viking pretending not to be seasick, furs were layered atop wool for maximum opulence. Nothing says, "I own 3 cows and a sense of purpose," like a shaggy wolf pelt worn dramatically over the shoulder while squinting into the northern lights. And in true Scandinavian style, fashion and function merged. Woolen garments were dyed with earthy plant-based hues, muted reds, soft greens, sky blues, colourful enough to spark joy, but subtle enough to keep you camouflaged should a rival tribe accidentally mistake you for someone who stole their goat. So next time you're sipping hot tea under a blanket, remember, somewhere in the icy past, a Viking stayed warm not with fire, but with sheep, saddled wool cloaks, and an unapologetically smart sense of layering. Now drift a little deeper into the night sea, where fleece billows in the wind and sails creak gently above. Because to truly feel the spirit of a Norse voyage, one must understand not only the splash of salt, but the soft scratch of wool. And just ahead, through the mist, our next lullaby of Viking ingenuity waits, quietly stitched into the seams. By the dim glow of northern twilight and the eternal creaking of wooden hulls against frostbitten waves, it may come as no surprise that the Vikings, tireless seafarers, wool-wrapped adventurers, part-time poets, and part-time pillagers, were also oddly proficient at staying warm, where warmth had absolutely no business being. It would be easy to suppose they just shouted loudly at the cold until it fled, terrified. But alas, it was a bit more nuanced than that. At the heart of their practices was the sacred Scandinavian art of layering. Not the ordinary sort of layering like that regrettable time you wore 8 sweaters and couldn't put your arms down. No, Viking layering was strategic. First came the soft linen tunic, pleasant as a whispered lullaby on the skin, followed by a woolen overtunic, then perhaps another tunic because once you've got one, why stop? Cloaks were flung over shoulders with polished brooches, because even if you're crossing a frozen sea, you still need to accessorize with dignity. Wool was the real hero here, dear listener. Viking wool was not the high-strung, fashion-conscious wool of today. No, it came from hearty, shaggy sheep, known as spelsau. Animals so rugged they probably chewed ice cubes recreationally. Their wool, thick with lanolin, was naturally water-resistant. An ideal textile for drizzle, blizzard, or unexpected splashes from a walrus encounter. Yes, that happened more than one might like to imagine. But perhaps the most unusual ally in the Viking arsenal was urine. Bear with me. The woolen undergarments and cloaks were often weathered with fermented urine, an ancient source of ammonia, to clean, tan, and somewhat waterproof the garments. Today we might call this unpleasant, but back then it was just a Tuesday. One can only hope that the celebrated Norse sagas kindly omitted scenes of vests being dunked in suspicious tubs. Now, indoors, when not at sea, warmth could be managed with a fire snugly nested in the longhouse hearth. But out on the open ocean, fires were impractical and frankly dangerous. Ships were made of wood after all, and wood tends to dislike being on fire while floating. So instead, warmth came from bodies, lots of them. Imagine a tightly packed crew, shoulder to hairy shoulder, exhaling steamy breath beneath a shared woolen canopy. It was less of a Viking ship, and more of a particularly burly slumber party. Body heat was a precious thing, passed around like gossip at a mead hall. And mead helped too, sweet liquid courage that warmed the chest even when the sea bit at the boots. They used thick furs when possible, bear, fox and reindeer, fashioned into hats and mittens and cloaks that probably made them all smell alarmingly like a woodland encounter. It is a little-known truth that your average Viking under sail would look less like the terrifying marauders of legend and more like a confused goat herder with excellent layering strategy. You may be wondering if sleeping on the ship was possible. The answer is yes, quite frequently, for weeks at a time. And since bedding down on planks was a short road to discomfort and possibly frozen cheeks, Vikings used straw-filled sacks or animal hides to lie on, creating a makeshift mattress that was surprisingly pleasant for an age that still measured comfort against not being attacked by a bear. Still, bodily warmth and natural fibers could only go so far against the cruel North Sea air. So they told stories, endless, winding, fireless tales shared in breathy tones beneath frozen stars. By retelling the epics of Odin and Thor, of dragons and heroes, they passed long hours in a kind of psychological warmth, storytime as survival, more enduring than wool, more mobile than fire. And so, picture it now, a boat slicing through icy tide, cloaks flapping like tired flags, the scent of salted fish and damp fur infused into every plank. Laughter rises, dull and muffled under moustaches. A song begins, not one you'd expect, but something half chanted, half forgotten. Not beautiful, but deeply warm. Somewhere in the fraying edge of their world, night has settled in, quiet and salted. The Vikings huddle tight, wrapped in layers of garment, kinship and story. And across the black water, the moon watches in still admiration. Soon, we'll drift gently toward one of their strangest cold weather companions. Tricky, delicious, and occasionally exploding. But that's a tale meant to boil and bubble on its own. While the rest of us might grumble when the office thermostat dips below 68 degrees Fahrenheit, the Vikings often sailed into winter winds so cold they could freeze your very soul. But politely, you know, in that Nordic way. And yet, fascinatingly, they did this not gritting their teeth, but wrapped in an enormous fluffy smirk of practicality. Picture the deck of a longship, seawater kissing the frozen edges, icicles forming tiny sparkly daggers along the railings. Around 20 or so men, burly, bearded, and probably needing a nap, huddled together beneath the gauzy whisper of fur-lined cloaks, breathing little clouds with every exhale. But despite everything, they were warm, or warmish, warm adjacent at least. And that's because those clever Norsemen were masters of personal insulation innovation. Now, you may have heard tell of Viking warriors clad in steel armor and horned helmets. That last bit, of course, being pure myth invented by 19th century opera enthusiasts with an appetite for exaggeration. But what the Vikings truly treasured wasn't horned regalia, but layers upon layers of very good, very itchy wool. You see, fire on a wooden ship was far too bold a choice, like lighting candles in a haystack, so textile became their torch. the average Viking would slip into a base layer of linen, breathable, soft, a bit of elbow room for rowing, and over that, fold themselves in a series of ever thicker wools. This, dear listener, was not fast fashion by any stretch. The wool was sturdy, homespun, the kind of wool that could double as either outerwear or a sheep in disguise. Cloaks were standard issue, fastened at the shoulder with brooches that told you everything you needed to know. Bjorn is here to conquer your village, but also he's rocking bronze filigree. These cloaks were not just warm, they were mobile bedrolls, tents, and probably, when necessary, tablecloths. Don't discount hats either. Woolen caps were essential. They kept the heat in, the icicles off, and the seagulls guessing who exactly was dressed as whom. For particularly cold voyages, you might spot men wrapping their faces in woven scarves, or stuffing bits of wool into their mittens. Gloves made from deerskin or wool were precious, more valuable than gold when sailing into a snowstorm that looked like it had feelings about you. Now here's a cozy little tidbit that slips under most history books and straight into the comforter of your imagination. Viking boots. Imagine hardened leather softened by wear, lined with sheepskin, and cleverly stuffed around the edges with dried grasses, proving once again that the Viking motto for survival might have been, when in doubt, stuff it with straw. Yes, straw. Dried sedge or moss was commonly crammed into worn boots for insulation. It didn't look elegant, but your toes stayed attached to your body. And that's a fashion statement worth warming to. But the greatest source of heat at sea may not have been their clothing at all. It might have been each other. The crew would nestle together, shoulder to shoulder, warmth being passed from one man to the next, like some sort of communal soup of body temperatures. Sleeping wrapped like sardines in furs, under woolen blankets and beside barrels of dried fish, was far from glamorous, but effective. And really, isn't that what any good sleepover needs? Friends, food smells, and an ever-present chance of hypothermia. Of course, Vikings didn't rely entirely on passive insulation. They worked hard, rowing, moving, bailing water, tying knots, endless movement that doubled as cardio. Raise your hand if you've ever warmed up by rowing a 75-foot sea serpent across the North Atlantic. No takers? Me neither. And let us not forget the fuel of the Viking furnace. Food. High-calorie diets powered these frosty forays. Butter, dried meats, nuts, and porridge kept the inner fire stoked. 1 pound of smoked mutton could go a long way toward heating your extremities via sheer metabolic enthusiasm. So no, they didn't build fires on their ships. The sea was no place for embers. But the Vikings brought their heat with them, woven into sweaters, hidden in straw, tucked inside their boots, and sealed snugly within their stubborn northern grit. As evening settles around us and the imaginary chill of Norse waters slips quietly into thought, just know, somewhere in the distant past, a Viking is spooning a barrel and wondering why the fish smell stronger near Olaf. And as for how they slept on those voyages, well, dear dreamer, let's drift quietly toward that sleeping deck and take a closer listen. Picture it now, midnight upon the North Sea, the moon licking the crest of every wave silver, and those longships, lean as otters, gliding through the brine-like shadows with oars. The Vikings, wrapped in wool, sitting in rows, damp, probably chilly, but surprisingly clever about it. Because, as we've established, having no hearth on board doesn't make you hopeless. It just means you're about to get intimate with the wonders of seal fat and strategic layering. Now, we've discussed fur, yes, and wool, absolutely yes. But here, let us turn our attention to the Norse innovation that doesn't get nearly enough credit for its humble brilliance. Welcome, if you will, the under-celebrated but overstuffed concept of the skinbrock. Literally, skin breeches. Smooth, but not just any trousers. These were pants stitched from the pelts of seals, reindeer, and yes, lads and lasses, occasionally the sheeps. Unlike modern-day ski gear, which hisses with synthetic smugness and zippers, these breeches were waterproof without making you sound like you'd wrestled a tent every time you shifted. Vikings often wore several layers, their version of the onion strategy. Start with an underlayer, often linen if they were lucky, then a tunic of wool, and then things got fuzzy, sometimes literally. The outerwear could be lined fur side inward in what I dare say was the coma-inducing embrace of thermal bliss. No central heating required, just a well-behaved reindeer. And there was the cloak too, the ever-dramatic signature Viking cloak, hefty and often fastened with a brooch so ornate it doubled as a conversation starter and possibly a defense mechanism. These cloaks were made of thick, coarse wool, often twilled, meaning the fibers were looped in such a way that wind would glance off it like a goose dodging compliments. When in doubt, they simply wrapped it tighter, burrito style, sealing in the warmth like a saucy secret. Of course, movement mattered. Sitting idle on icy planks, even wrapped in the cozy couture of 10th century Scandinavia, was a one-way ticket to frost-numbed bottom disorder. And so, the oars. Each stroke wasn't just a means of transport, it was a cardiovascular triumph. Rowing kept the blood surging through their limbs, burning hot calories and melting whatever chilly discomfort cottoned at their toes. Essentially, the Vikings had accidentally invented CrossFit, minus the hashtags and deeply opinionated t-shirts. Then there's the matter of food. You might not expect victuals to warm the soul, unless you've ever tried roasted blubber stew with wild garlic and a pinch of thyme, or whatever moss looked spicy. These seafaring snackers kept stores of dried fish, smoked meats, and fermented grains, which, while not exactly Michelin-starred, provided calories by the sackful. And calories, dear listener, are the body's version of firewood. Now, what about hot drinks, you ask from under your blanket? A hot cup of something would have been lovely, yes, but keep in mind, no fire on board. So unless their longship came with a travelling barista, and there's no archaeological evidence of that yet, they couldn't boil water while at sea. So what did they sip? Well, much like you, the Vikings were frequent enjoyers of mead, ale, and other fermented fix-me-ups. Even if it was cold, it still warmed the belly. If not immediately, then eventually, with enough enthusiasm. But perhaps the strangest adaptation of all was teamwork. Snuggling, for lack of a more historically respectful term. Vikings weren't above sharing body heat. Scouts curled up beside warriors, and when night forced a halt on some sheltered fjord, they'd nest beneath animal skins like wolves in a pack, pragmatic and mutually grateful for collective emissions of body warmth. Say what you will about raiding. Those folks knew how to huddle. Even their ships helped. The longships, though open-decked, were cleverly built to shed water quickly and hold sturdy against the wind. Their familiarity with the sea made them swift, yes, but also somewhat cozy. For a pinewood bench in the middle of a frigid ocean, the planks were caulked with moss and animal hair smeared in tar, which, besides being surprisingly waterproof, must have smelled like an old smoky bear who'd taken up roofing. Comforting in its way. And so, as the stars shimmered above the yawning sea and oars sliced rhythmically into midnight waves, the Vikings rowed on, cloaked and clever, well-fed and fur-wrapped, smelling faintly of seal blubber and heroic tales yet to be told. But what happened when they set foot on shore, stiff-legged and salt-crusted? That's where things get particularly aromatic. We'll drift toward that story next. The wind had grown moody on the North Sea, lashing soft waves of frost against wooden hulls shaped like dragon dreams. One would think the Vikings, in their longships, with no chimneys, hearths, or so much as a steaming kettle of cocoa in sight, would have frozen into bearded popsicles by the time they reached anywhere colder than slightly uncomfortable. Yet, they endured, with noses intact and toes only moderately frostbitten on occasion. So how exactly did these sea-hardened Scandinavians stay warm without setting their boats on fire? It's not as if they could toss a log on the hearth mid-voyage. Fires aboard wooden vessels, especially ones packed with dried fish, hemp rope, and unspoken tensions, tend to turn quickly from warming comfort to historically interesting shipwreck. The answer, neutral and woolly as an old sweater, lay in layers. Not psychological layers, though those likely help too. Imagine the inner peace it takes to row for 8 hours daily in a snowstorm while humming about Odin. But literal textile layers. Under their impressively smelly cloaks and iron-studded tunics, Vikings wore tightly woven woolen undergarments that today would easily qualify as classified knitwear. Wool, that miracle fiber provided by the humble sheep, was the mighty secret. Unlike cotton, which clings to body heat like a bored house cat at best, wool insulates even when damp. And let's be honest, everything the Vikings wore was damp most of the time. North Sea weather has all the charm of a wet sponge wrapped around a howling ghost. These woolen basics, long-sleeve tunics, leggings, and those sock-like foot wrappings called leggings worked in concert like a woven battlefield choir, singing warmth into every blessed limb. When combined with heavier cloaks, often fur-trimmed and never fashion-forward, the ensemble ensured that Vikings could conduct cold-weather pillaging, trading, or philosophically gazing into the mist without developing unfortunate frostbeards. Then came the hoods, or as the more medievally inclined might call them, cowls. These were often attached to cloaks or worn separately with an adorable shoulder caplet that screamed, "I raid settlements, but I also enjoy thoughtful strolls." The hood helped trap heat around the ears, without needing to invent earmuffs a millennium ahead of schedule. Of course, there's the interesting case of the Viking ear flap hat, or rather, the lack thereof. Despite the blizzard-worthy conditions, there's relatively little evidence these hats existed in the way we might expect. A historical oversight? Possibly. Or perhaps the Vikings simply didn't mind cold ears. An early cultural embrace of selective numbness. Now, let us not forget their bedding, a crucial factor when sleeping aboard something that resembles a lorikeet's canoe filled with swords. On longer voyages, they would bring along animal pelts, thick sheepskins laid over wooden planks, along with surprisingly luxurious furs to curl beneath as the ship rocked them to sleep. The longship, while not known for spa-like amenities, at least allowed rest that was warmer than the air trying to freeze your eyeballs. And speaking of bodily heat, Vikings weren't above sharing it. If huddling like particularly grumpy puffins helped survival, then so be it. Communal warmth wasn't just practical, it was cultural. It was the Viking version of central heating, minus programmable thermostats, and plus one slightly snoring berserker named Bjorn. Another lifesaver: diet. High-fat meals, think seal blubber, maybe a roasted reindeer knee, would stoke internal furnaces with all the elegance of a well-fed volcano. Warming from the inside out, They marched and sailed with bellies full of caloric defense systems, which made them, in a way, walking wool-covered ovens. Even their weapons lent a sort of accidental insulation. Thick belts to carry axes, straps for shields, hide wrappings, and layered armor, all added to the microclimate nestled around the body. Who knew being a walking armory could come with such perks? And all the while, without embers, without cozy cabins or hot tea, these frost-tangling navigators moved over oceans like ice-slicked whispers. As our candlelight fades to a flicker, and the longship coasts beneath a soft chorus of stars, imagine the sound of wool brushing against wool, the scent of salt and fur, and the gentle snores of a crew guiltily warm in a fireless world. The sea rocks like a cradle. The horizon hums low-eyed dreams, but the real warmth that slept inside them. A fireless fire wound tight in wool stubbornness, and perhaps just a touch of divine madness. Next, let the cold waters part as we sail softly towards something altogether more smelly, Viking hygiene, or the shining lack thereof. During a particularly long, frostbitten voyage to somewhere vague and probably terrifying, a Viking ship cuts through the North Sea like a drunken walrus, loud, determined, and surprisingly well insulated. By now, we've already established that fire on board a wooden vessel bobbing on the icy sea was about as welcome as a hiccup in a monastery scriptorium. So what else did the Norse seafarers use to survive the cold, particularly at sea? The answer, dear listener, lies in one of the Viking Age's overlooked heroes, communal body heat. Now I know that doesn't sound particularly glamorous. In fact, it sounds suspiciously like a 9th century cuddle party in a glorified canoe. But if you're picturing large, grim warriors wedged together like smoked salmon in a barrel, well, you're not wrong. Viking ships, especially the sleek longships, didn't have much in the way of cozy nooks. There were no cabins or enclosed spaces unless you were sailing on one of the more luxurious Nars, essentially the Viking cargo cruise liner. But for most, warmth came from sheer wool, constant movement, and a hearty helping of shared suffering. The warriors wrapped themselves in thick cloaks made of wool so heavy it could block wind, rain, and the unrelenting side-eye of disapproving gods. But wool alone only got you so far. Now imagine 20 or 30 of these wool-cloaked sea pilgrims sitting shoulder to shoulder on the deck, snoring, grumbling, sharing dried fish, and occasionally leaning just a tad too heavily into one another. The heat generated by close quarters, plus the waterproofing efforts of oiled cloaks, created a surprisingly effective microclimate. Some sagas even mention men complaining of steaming under all their layers, a Nordic sauna by way of sheer bodily inconvenience. And let us not forget the humble undergarment. Yes, the Viking equivalent of long johns, linen or woolen breeches, sometimes even with an extra layer of thigh ropes for warmth and support. The name might make it sound like a medieval fitness accessory, but they were essentially knitted leg hugs tied at the knee, proving once again that the Vikings loved comfort almost as much as conquest. But clothing wasn't all. Let's talk about seal fat. No, not as a snack, though yes, sometimes that too, but as a protective balm. Vikings rubbed rendered animal fat into their skin to guard against bitter winds and exposure, turning themselves into rather slippery but well-preserved warriors. It was like an ancient form of moisturizing, but instead of a spa, they were on a leaking boat halfway to unknown doom. The scent, we imagine, was somewhere between wet dog and alarming candle shop, but it kept the skin intact and the frostbite at bay. And then, of course, there were the rituals, the sleepy, half-sung rhythms of the sea. Long voyages weren't just screams and storms. They came with music. Norse crews would chant together, not only to pass time, but to keep rhythm as they rowed. These chants, known as drottkvet, could be quite poetic. Think of them as battle lullabies, half poetry slam, half sea shanty, all deeply nasal. When sung in unison, the act generated warmth, not just of body, but of spirit. And as we all know, nothing repels the cold like the shared mumble of men too proud to harmonize. Meals, too, were surprisingly strategic. The Vikings didn't just pack dried fish and sadness. No, they included fatty meats, cheeses, and dense rye bread. Calorie-heavy fuel that acted like wood in the metaphorical stove of the human body. Everything they ate was designed to burn slow and hot, like a good bonfire, or an awkward conversation with your chieftain's daughter. And when all else failed, when the winds howled, the sea hissed, and even the seals looked too judgmental, they wrapped themselves in their cloaks, curled around their shields, and stared up at the northern sky. Maybe they watched the stars. Maybe they muttered prayers to Thor or Odin, or anyone kind enough to keep the frost from seizing their nostrils. And maybe, just maybe, they thought of home, warmed by the thought of mead halls, fires, and beds that didn't sway. Sleep came in fits and starts on those long nights afloat. But as the groaning hull rocked them gently and the waves whispered their cold lullaby, even the hardest Viking softened under that patchwork of warmth, fur, and trust. And as their eyes drew closed, one might wonder, what of their dreams? Did they dream of conquest, of sun-drenched shores, of something suspiciously like a woolen blanket that didn't smell like seal? But those dreams, those are another story entirely. Long before thermostats, Snuggies, and Argyle-patterned hot water bottles, Vikings faced a wintry world with nothing more than ingenuity in sheep. Not live sheep, well, sometimes live sheep, but mostly the kind you wear after polite shearing and surprisingly aggressive felting. By now, we've sailed with our bearded boatmates through fjords and fog, weathered storms and stumbled into sausages, but let us now lower our voice and listen closely to the hum of the hearthless heat source aboard their longships. Because despite the icy glimmers of the North Sea, the Vikings managed to build boats that were not just sleek and deadly, but somehow cozy, in their uniquely drafty, damp, and dragon-headed way. It starts with layers. Glorious, scratchy, woolen layers. Viking clothing wasn't just fashion, it was armor against the cold. First came the softest layer, soft here being a generous exaggeration, crafted from linen or underwool. A sort of medieval long john, minus the buttons and awkward family Christmas photos. On top of that, wool. So much wool. Wool tunics, wool trousers, and yes, for those truly dashing, wool leg wrappings that look something between a boot and a rebellious sock. These wrappings, called wickleband, were strips of cloth spiraled up the leg like decorative burritos, held in place with what were essentially woolen parking brakes, fibulae, or brooches. Not only did they keep the cold out and the boot blisters in check, they also looked fantastically heroic when catching the wind on a frosty morning. Now, you may be wondering, did our seafaring Scandinavians wear fur? Absolutely. From bears, foxes, seals, even squirrels. If it had fur, it might end up on a Viking. Not as a pelted trophy, but as a practical nose-chilling shield against the biting chill of Norwegian gusts. Noblemen might wear thicker, softer pelts, while the average farmer-turned-raider might make do with what he could trap, barter, or inherit. But the real Viking winter secret wasn't fur. It was insulation by presence. Picture it, dozens of burly Norsemen crammed shoulder to shoulder like a cargo of pickled herring wearing hornless hats. Human bodies are essentially portable radiators. They may grunt and snore while emitting suspicious smells, but in the bitter cold, you don't complain, you scooch closer. A longship packed with people, cloaks, and the occasional sheepdog became, in effect, a floating sauna with trust issues. Some scholars believe the Vikings used tents or canopies aboard their ships, especially during longer voyages. These makeshift coverings, fashioned from sailcloth or hide, stretched over wooden frames, created a sort of dreamlike longhouse at sea, keeping out the night wind and huddling the warmth in, like a crumpled origami apartment building for warriors with fantastic cheekbones. As for fire, while actual flames at sea were a bad idea, especially on wooden ships soaked in salty ambition, Vikings brought along portable fire-making kits, flint, steel, and a cozy little bundle of tinder made from mushroom matter, for real, called amadou. Think of it as organic kindling with hipster appeal. If desperate, they may have once perched on shore to light fires, especially near river mouths during portage. But on the boat, warmth came from within, from people, from furs, from wool, and from a mentally cultivated cheerfulness that only someone raised on fermented herring could convincingly summon. At night, the lucky ones draped themselves in cloaks and lay close together among the cargo, or as it was known then, breakfast in a barrel. The rhythmic creak of the hull, the percussion of waves, and the gentle wheeze of sleep gave the ship its own lullaby. One almost wishes for a scratch and sniff book of Viking slumber. Almost. And what of their feet? Those noble, frostbitten friends carrying them from raid to farm and back again. Enter the marvelous turnshoe, a stitched leather boot, so named because it was made inside out and then flipped right side in like a pastry made by someone with a foot fetish and arthritis. Lined with wool or fur, waterproofed with animal fat, these humble shoes were as vital as any axe or ale horn. So picture a boat not cold and cruel, but warm from within, like a sea-bound sandwich of wool, sweat, and storied dreams. A place where warriors slept side by side beneath the stars, wrapped in lawn toga-level linens, planning their next landing and wondering if there would be time to wash their socks beforehand. Whether wrapped in fox fur or friendship, the Vikings stayed warm through wits, wool, and the power of relatively organized spooning. And on that note, as we quietly slip past yet another frost-dappled shoreline, we begin to glimpse not just how they survived, but how they thrived. With only the north wind for an alarm clock, let's let that wind carry us toward what came next. And now, at last, the longboat rocks gently on the ink-stained waves of night, its carved dragon prow no longer snarling, but seeming almost to yawn. The oars are stilled, cloaks are wrapped tight, and a quiet snooze settles upon the crew like mist on a fjord. No war cries, just snoring. The final lull in a journey defined by wool, wind, and wonderfully impractical hairstyles. You see, in the grand extravaganza of Viking survival, staying warm without fire was not merely an act of courage, but an elaborate, woolly dance with nature. They didn't just endure the cold. They wore it like a slightly damp, fur-lined badge of honor. And those beards, not a fashion choice. Well, not only a fashion choice. Like one's favorite neck scarf had decided to grow a personality and follow you everywhere. But here, as their knuckles thaw under the comfort of sleep and the sail groans softly in the breeze, we can whisper the last of our icy secrets. Let's take a moment to admire the ingenuity lurking beneath their animal hides and stormy stares. Their cloaks were often made from tightly woven wool, some even treated with lanolin, the sheep's own built-in weatherproof conditioner. A Viking sailor's coat smelled faintly of damp sheep and salt spray, which admittedly might not fetch compliments at a midsummer feast, but did wonders against wind and wave. They practiced a kind of cold weather layering that would make modern outdoor brands nod in agreement. A linen tunic under a woolen layer, perhaps a cloak draped over one shoulder and pinned with a brooch. A practical fashion statement and a very sharp way to fasten fabric, both literally and stylishly. Keep in mind, brooches doubled as deterrents. One badly aimed hug and you'd remember your manners next time. For trousers, think rough spun wool, leggings, sometimes bound at the calf with winninger. Woolen strips that sort of made everyone's legs look mildly gift-wrapped. It wasn't about elegance, it was about function. Cold knees were the true enemy, and they weren't above accessorizing with pelts and skins. Fox fur for warmth, bear fur for bravado, and sheepskin for everything in between. In truly dire conditions, they'd wrap their shoes, often made from stitched leather and stuffed with straw or moss for insulation, in extra fabric, like burritos but for feet. Still, even the cleverest cloak can only do so much when the North Sea gives you her cold shoulder. And so, Vikings leaned into a communal charm, body heat, sail cuddling we might call it, a heap of limbs and elbows and occasional helmet dents, all sharing the stored warmth of stew-like breath and shared hardship. It may not have been graceful, but it was effective. And in the morning, anyone buried too deep under sleeping comrades would emerge as an accidental flapjack of warrior warmth. Now, as those dream-filled snores whisper across the icy tide, we must admit that not even the boldest Viking was immune to chills, and not all of them were stoic. Archaeology doesn't tell us how often someone muttered, "Ugh, my toes," but one suspects it was often, and with feeling. Still, their resilience lies not just in cloaks or cloistered rowing, but in the quiet hum of nights like this, when sails luff gently above them, and woolen cloaks rise and fall with each breath, like ancient fuzz-covered bellows. When the stars drip silver through frost, and the horizon waits, sleepy and unread, for new adventures scrawled by awe and time. We don't often think of Vikings in their quieter moments, their contemplative stares, their early morning groans as they untangle beard from blanket. We imagine them mid-pillage, not mid-snooze. But perhaps it's in these gentle middles that we find the truest magic of history, the human thrum beneath the horned myth. No, they never wore horned helmets, but they did wear a kind of glory stitched with wool and warmed by fate. And that, perhaps, is the coziest truth of all. So now, let the longboat drift. Let the waves shush you. The stars wink kindly overhead. The fireless cold has done nothing to dim their stories, only coloured them with frost-rimmed wonder. And as their breath clouds the darkness and dreams take awe once more, let yours drift quietly with them, down into sleep, wrapped in wool and wonder.